The sun rose over Fort Sheridan in Illinois on a cold morning in March 1945, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at attention in the communications tent, her uniform pressed sharp as a knife blade, her dark blonde hair pinned back in perfect military fashion. She was 32 years old, lean and strong, with the kind of face that didn't reveal much unless you looked into her eyes. There you could see everything: determination, hurt, hope. Around her, the tent buzzed with activity. Young soldiers moved between desks stacked with papers and radio equipment. Maps covered every available wall, showing the advance of American forces into Germany. The war was reaching its final chapter, and everyone could feel it. The Allies were pushing deep into enemy territory now, closing in from all sides. But for Sarah, there was only silence. No one spoke to her unless absolutely necessary. She had been assigned to Fort Sheridan 3 weeks ago as a communications specialist. She could operate any radio equipment the Army owned. She could decode messages faster than officers half her age. She could organize information in ways that saved lives, but none of that mattered to most of the men here. To them, she was simply a woman in a uniform, an oddity, a problem. "Get me the status report from the field," barked Colonel James Warren, the commanding officer. He didn't look at Sarah when he said it. He never looked at her. He addressed the room in general, as if assuming one of the men would handle it. It was always this way. Sarah moved without hesitation. She had already prepared the report. She had anticipated this request because she always anticipated what her commanding officers would need. That was the difference between being good at your job and being exceptional. She had learned long ago that exceptional might not be enough, but it was all she had. "Colonel Warren," she said quietly, approaching his desk. "The status report, updated as of 0600 hours this morning." Colonel Warren glanced at the paper she held out. His eyes moved across it for exactly 3 seconds before he looked away. "Fine, put it with the others," he said, turning his attention to a map spread across his desk. Behind him stood Major Robert Hammond, a man with sharp features and sharper eyes. Major Hammond watched Sarah as she placed the report on the desk. She caught something in his expression, not respect exactly, but recognition. He saw her work, she knew that much. But seeing and acting were two different things. Sarah returned to her station. Private Derek Thompson sat at the desk next to hers, hunched over a stack of transmission logs. He was 19, from a farm in Nebraska, with freckles and a boyish face that made him look even younger than he was. He caught her eye as she sat down. "They still treating you like you're invisible?" he asked quietly. "It doesn't matter what they think," Sarah said, but her voice carried a weight that contradicted the words. It did matter. Every day it mattered. Every time Colonel Warren made a decision without asking her opinion, every time a junior officer second-guessed her work, every time she heard whispered comments about women having no business in combat operations, it mattered. But showing that it mattered was the quickest way to confirm their worst suspicions about women, that they were emotional, unreliable, not suited for real military work. "You're better than half the intelligence officers here," Derek said, returning his focus to the logs. "Maybe better than most of them." "Rank matters more than ability," Sarah replied simply. "That's just how it is." But even as she said the words, something inside her rebelled against them. She had spent the last decade proving herself. She had worked harder than anyone else. She had never made a mistake. She had never complained. She had simply shown up every day and done the work that needed to be done. And it had gotten her this, a tent full of men who didn't see her. That afternoon, the real work began. A messenger arrived from the 1st Army headquarters, bringing urgent dispatches about the German situation. Sarah watched as Colonel Warren and Major Hammond bent over the communications equipment, receiving transmission after transmission. The language was coded, but Sarah could read codes like other people read newspapers. She had been trained at Fort Monmouth, one of the few women in her entire class. She had scored higher than the men on every test. She listened as the messages came through. There was something happening in Germany, something large. American and British forces were executing an operation that went beyond the typical back and forth of frontline warfare. This was a coordinated movement, a pincer, a trap. The messages mentioned the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. If the Allies could encircle it, trap the German forces inside, the war could be over within weeks, months. The entire outcome of the campaign depended on precise coordination and perfect information flow. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was real history being made, transmitted through radios, recorded on papers, flowing through the tent where she worked. And she was part of it. Even if no one else acknowledged it, she was part of it. Mitchell, Major Hammond called out. It was the first time he had addressed her directly. "Come here." Sarah stood immediately and walked to where he stood with Colonel Warren. Both men were studying a map of the Ruhr Valley. "This intelligence coming from the field," Major Hammond said, pointing to the decoded messages Sarah had just finished arranging. "Your work." "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "It's good work," he said. He didn't say it as a compliment. He said it as a fact, a simple observation. "We need perfect information from this point forward. No errors, no confusion. The operation depends on coordination between 5 different armies across 3 countries. One breakdown in communications and it falls apart." "I understand, sir," Sarah said. "Do you?" Colonel Warren finally looked at her. His eyes were cold and assessing. "Because if there's going to be any problem, any slowdown, any confusion with how information is passed, I need to know now. I don't have time to wonder if information from a woman is reliable." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because of their cruelty, though they were cruel, but because she had heard variations of this her entire career. The assumption that gender was somehow connected to competence, that her ability to do the job was inherently in question. "You won't have any problems, sir," Sarah said, and her voice was ice, cold and controlled. "See that we don't," Colonel Warren said, turning back to the map. Sarah returned to her station, but her hands trembled slightly as she organized the next batch of messages. Derek noticed and pushed a cup of coffee toward her. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Fine," she said, and then after a pause, "No, I'm angry." "You should be." "That won't help anything," Sarah said. She picked up the coffee and took a long drink. The bitterness matched her mood perfectly. "What helps is doing the job so well that they can't possibly say anything. What helps is being so essential that they can't function without you." "And then what?" Derek asked. Sarah didn't answer because she didn't know. She had been following that strategy for a decade, and all it had gotten her was overlooked, underestimated, invisible in a room full of people. But that was about to change. Over the next 36 hours, the scale of the operation became clear. The Ruhr Pocket was the code name for an encirclement operation that was about to trap German forces in the most important industrial region in Germany. American forces were closing in from the south, while British forces approached from the north. German units were being pushed back and back into an increasingly smaller area. If the Allies could coordinate perfectly, if they could keep German forces from breaking out, they could capture or destroy an entire German army group. 500,000 soldiers, maybe more. It was the kind of victory that could shorten the war by months, could save hundreds of thousands of lives. And it depended on information flowing correctly through the communication system. Sarah worked through the night, processing messages, decoding transmissions, organizing intelligence. Her station became a nerve center of activity. Other soldiers began seeking her out, asking her to clarify information, asking her where things should go, asking her what she thought about particular tactical movements. At first, she was too tired to notice. At some point around 2 in the morning, she realized what was happening. They were trusting her. They were coming to her for answers because her answers were always right. She saw Major Hammond watching her from across the tent, his expression thoughtful. By dawn, Sarah had processed more than 200 discrete pieces of military information. She had coordinated with field units in 4 different locations. She had caught 2 errors in transmissions that could have sent American soldiers in the wrong direction. She had organized the intelligence flow so cleanly, so clearly, that even the newer soldiers could understand the big picture of the operation. And no one mentioned it. Colonel Warren received briefings based on her work. Major Hammond made decisions based on her intelligence. Officers discussed strategy around a table, using information she had prepared, never once crediting its source. That was the pattern, that was always the pattern. Sarah stood outside the tent as the sun rose, drinking terrible coffee from a metal cup. The morning air was cold and sharp. She was 32 years old, and she had spent half her life proving her worth to people who had already decided she didn't have any. Derek found her standing there. "You should try to sleep," he said. "I will," Sarah replied, "after the operation is finished." "That could be weeks." "I know," Sarah said. She looked out at the barracks and the vehicles and the soldiers moving through the base. "But that's what it takes, isn't it? That's what it takes to be seen." What Sarah didn't know was that being seen was about to come at a higher price than she could have imagined. What she didn't know was that the next few weeks would test not just her competence, but her character. That she would face decisions that would force her to choose between loyalty and truth, between following orders and doing what was right. The Ruhr pocket was about to become the stage for her greatest trial and her greatest triumph. The walls of the communications tent were covered with new maps by March 28, 1945. These weren't the careful, pre-planned maps of military maneuvers. These were battle maps, living maps, constantly updated, constantly changing. Red lines marked German positions. Blue lines showed American and British forces. The red area in the middle, the Ruhr Valley, was getting smaller every day. The trap was closing. Sarah had not slept in 38 hours. She could feel the exhaustion in her bones, in her muscles, in the way her vision sometimes seemed to blur at the edges. But she couldn't stop. The operation was at a critical phase. Decisions made in this tent would determine whether 500,000 German soldiers escaped or were captured or killed. The weight of that knowledge kept her moving. "Mitchell," Colonel Warren called, "I need you to coordinate with the British units north of the Ruhr. We need real-time updates on their position. If there's any gap between their advance and ours, the Germans will exploit it. I want to know the moment anything changes." This was significant, and Sarah knew it. Coordinating with British forces meant working across international lines. It meant taking direct responsibility for information that was even more critical than before. It meant that if something went wrong, there would be no hiding behind other people's errors. It would be on her. "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "I'll establish a direct line." She moved to a radio set that had been recently installed at the far corner of the tent. This one connected directly to British 8th Army headquarters. She had tested it twice in the past day. It worked, but the signal was inconsistent. Sometimes crystal clear, sometimes buried in static. She would need to be extremely careful. "We should get someone else to handle that," a young officer named Captain Wesley said. He was standing near Colonel Warren, and he had spoken loudly enough that everyone in the tent could hear. "That's a pretty important line, maybe someone with more experience." The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Every eye in the tent turned to look at either Captain Wesley or Sarah, depending on their comfort level with open conflict. "Captain Wesley," Major Hammond said, his voice quiet but firm. "Captain Mitchell has more experience with long-distance coordination than anyone on this base. If you have concerns about the quality of her work, I suggest you keep them to yourself." Major Hammond turned his back to the captain, deliberately dismissing him, and walked toward Sarah's station. When he reached her, he lowered his voice so only she could hear. "Don't mind him," Hammond said. "He's looking for reasons to complain because he's scared about what's happening. Fear makes people stupid." "He's not entirely wrong," Sarah said, surprising herself with her honesty. "An error on that line could create serious problems." "Yes," Hammond agreed, "which is exactly why you need to be the one handling it. You won't make an error." There was something in the way he said it that made Sarah look up at him. Major Hammond was studying the radio equipment, his expression neutral. But he had absolute confidence in what he had just said. Not hope, not optimism, certainty. "Thank you, sir," Sarah said. "Don't thank me," Hammond replied. "Just do the job, that's all that matters now." Over the next 6 hours, Sarah established and maintained the British line. She sent and received 73 separate transmissions. She decoded intelligence about German troop movements. She coordinated timing between American and British units. She flagged 2 situations where the British had intelligence about German movements that the Americans didn't have, and she made sure that intelligence reached Colonel Warren in real time. By 1800 hours, the gap between American and British forces had narrowed from 12 miles to 3 miles. The Ruhr pocket was tightening. The trap was beginning to close in earnest. That evening, Sarah sat in the mess tent with Derek, pushing food around her plate without much interest. She was too tired to eat, too wired to sleep. Her mind was still partially plugged into the radio frequencies. Even now, hearing the static in the background of the tent, she was listening, waiting for the next transmission, the next crisis. "You look like you're about to fall over," Derek observed. "I'm fine," Sarah said automatically. "You're not fine. You're running on coffee and anger." Sarah set her fork down. "Is it working?" "Yes," Derek said. "You're being taken seriously now. I can see the way people look at you. It's different." Even Wesley looks at you like he respects you now, even though he probably hates that he has to. It doesn't feel like it's working, Sarah said quietly. It feels like I'm just proving what everyone assumed was true, that I can do this job, but they still wouldn't have believed it without seeing me prove it. That's not fair, Derek said. No, Sarah agreed, it's not. An alarm sounded through the tent. Not the routine alert bells that went off regularly, but the urgent signal that meant something critical was happening. Sarah was on her feet before she could think about it, her exhaustion gone in a moment of adrenaline. She ran back to the communications tent. The place was already in chaos. Colonel Warren was shouting orders. Major Hammond was on the telephone with 1st Army headquarters. Soldiers were moving frantically between desks. German counterattack, someone said. 2 Panzer divisions. Coming from the east. Sarah moved to her station and began monitoring all the frequencies at once. Information started flooding in. German forces were attempting to break out of the closing pocket. They had identified the weakest point in the American line, a gap between 2 advancing units where the German commander thought he could force his way through. If he succeeded, if the Germans could punch through and get forces out of the pocket, the entire operation would be compromised. Months of planning, thousands of soldiers preparing for this moment, all of it could fall apart. I need updated positions on the German formation, Colonel Warren shouted. Now. Sarah was already compiling the information. Radio reports were coming in from field units. Field cameras were transmitting what they could see. Sarah took all of it and organized it into a clear picture that showed exactly where the German forces were, where they were moving, and where the American line was weakest. She added one more thing to the report, a recommendation, a tactical suggestion based on the information she had. She brought it to Colonel Warren. He looked at it for a long moment. "This is good work," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "What's this recommendation?" "If we shift the 2nd Battalion from their current position and move them northeast," Sarah pointed to the map, "they can intercept the German Panzer Division before it reaches the main breakthrough point. It cuts their advance time by approximately 14 minutes. That's enough time for the 1st Battalion to reinforce the main line." Colonel Warren stared at the map. Sarah could see him considering it, the weight of the decision, the risk if her information was wrong, the cost if he didn't make the move and the Germans broke through. "Do it," he said finally. He turned to an aide. "Get this recommendation to 1st Army. Tell them it's based on the latest intelligence." "Colonel Warren," Sarah said quietly, "if they're going to follow this recommendation, they should understand it came from detailed analysis, not just a guess. They should know what information led to this conclusion." For the first time, Colonel Warren looked directly at Sarah, and there was something different in his expression, something that looked like respect. "You're right," he said. "Put together a full briefing packet, show all your work, make sure 1st Army understands exactly what you're basing this on." It took Sarah 47 minutes to assemble the briefing, 47 minutes while the battle was unfolding in real time. She worked with total focus, showing every piece of information, every calculation, every step of the analysis. She wanted no one to be able to question the foundation of her recommendation. When she was finished, the briefing was handed to Major Hammond, who transmitted it directly to 1st Army headquarters. The hours that followed were the longest of Sarah's life. She monitored the radio frequencies as the battle unfolded. The 2nd Battalion began moving to the new position. The German Panzer Division started its assault. The American line braced for impact. At 21:47 hours, the 2nd Battalion made contact with the German advance. The fighting was intense and chaotic, but the timing worked. By moving the unit northeast, the Americans had intercepted the German forces before they could reach the main breakthrough point. The German attack stalled. It collapsed. German units that had been advancing aggressively suddenly found themselves in a defensive posture, fighting on 2 fronts. By 2300 hours, the crisis had passed. The German breakthrough attempt had failed. The Ruhr pocket was still closed. The trap was still intact. Sarah sat at her station, and for the first time in 6 hours, she let herself take a full breath. Major Hammond appeared beside her desk, holding a cup of coffee that was probably as terrible as all the coffee at Fort Sheridan. "That recommendation you made," he said. "1st Army is very interested in how you came to that conclusion." "It was just analysis," Sarah said. No, Hammond replied. Analysis is what the officers are supposed to do. What you did was think ahead of the battle. You were seeing what should happen before anyone else saw it. That's the difference between being smart and being brilliant. Does it matter? Sarah asked. The breakthrough was stopped, that's what matters. It matters to them, Hammond said. He sat down next to her, which was unusual. Officers didn't usually sit down with enlisted people unless there was a specific reason. First Army wants to know more about the woman who put that analysis together. They're asking questions. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Questions were dangerous. Attention was dangerous. The safest thing was to do your job and stay invisible. Being noticed meant being examined. Being examined meant being judged. What kind of questions? She asked carefully. The kind that could change your life, Hammond said. I'm not supposed to tell you this yet, but I'm going to anyway. You're being considered for a special assignment. Something that goes beyond this tent. Something that puts you directly involved in the most important intelligence work of the entire operation. I don't want that, Sarah said immediately. Why not? Hammond looked genuinely surprised by her response. Because it means I'll be responsible for everything. Every error will be mine. Every mistake will be mine. Yes, Hammond said simply. But so will every success. You'll finally be seen, finally be credited with what you do. Sarah thought about that. She thought about a decade of invisible work. She thought about Colonel Warren finally looking at her with something like respect. She thought about Derek's comment that people were looking at her differently now. I need to think about it, she said. You don't have much time, Hammond replied. He stood up. They want an answer tomorrow. He walked away, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and a cup of terrible coffee. Derek found her an hour later, still sitting at her station even though the crisis had passed, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the next one. You got the promotion? Derek asked. How did you know? Because Hammond looks happy, Derek said. And Hammond doesn't look happy about things that don't involve you being recognized for what you do. It's not a promotion, Sarah said. It's just a different assignment. That's what a promotion is, Derek said. He sat down next to her. You should take it. I don't know if I want it, Sarah admitted. I don't know if I want that kind of responsibility. You already have that responsibility, Derek pointed out. The difference is whether people acknowledge it or not, whether you get credit for it or not, whether your work actually matters or is just invisible. Sarah knew he was right. She had always known he was right. The question was whether she was brave enough to step into the light after spending so long in the shadows. She looked at the maps on the walls. The red lines representing German forces were retreating now. The blue lines representing American and British forces were advancing. The Ruhr pocket was tightening. The trap was closing. And somewhere in that closing trap were 500,000 German soldiers. Their fates were being determined in this tent, by the information that flowed through these radios, by the analysis that was being done at desks like hers. If she accepted this assignment, she would be at the center of that. Her name might not be on the official reports. Her face might not be in the history books, but she would know. She would know that history had moved through her hands. I'll take it, she said quietly. Derek smiled. I knew you would. The next morning, Sarah met with Colonel Warren and Major Hammond in a private office. What they told her changed everything. They were putting her in charge of all intelligence coordination for the final phase of the Ruhr Pocket operation. She would be working directly with command officers from 3 different armies. She would be responsible for ensuring that every piece of information was accurate, organized, and delivered in real time. It was, in every practical sense, a combat command, and Sarah would be the first woman to hold such a position. There will be people who object, Colonel Warren said. It was as close to an apology as she would ever get from him. People who don't think a woman belongs in this role, but the job was done right by you, and that's all that matters to me now. Make sure you continue doing it right. I will, sir, Sarah said. See that you do, Colonel Warren replied. What Sarah didn't know was that someone in the tent had already decided to object. Someone who had been watching her rise in influence and respect. Someone who saw her success as a threat. Someone who had a plan to make sure that Sarah Mitchell never received the credit she deserved. And that plan was about to be set in motion. Sarah moved into a new office on April 2nd, 1945. It was small, barely larger than a storage closet, but it was hers. A desk, a chair, A telephone that connected directly to First Army headquarters, maps covering the walls, and a nameplate that read Captain Sarah Mitchell, Intelligence Coordinator. Captain, the rank hit her differently now. She had been promoted ahead of schedule based on her performance during the crisis. She was the first woman to reach this rank in her unit. She was 48 hours into the new position when she noticed something was wrong. It started small. A transmission that arrived out of sequence. A field report that contradicted intelligence from another source by a small margin. Nothing that would catch the attention of most people. Nothing that would register as anything other than routine confusion in the fog of war. But Sarah noticed. Sarah had spent 10 years training herself to notice everything, to see the patterns underneath the chaos, to understand when information didn't fit together. She began tracking the discrepancies, creating a log. At first, she thought it might be honest mistakes. Different units in the field collecting information slightly differently, different interpretations of the same events. But as the days went on, the discrepancies began to form a pattern. They were too consistent to be random, too specific to be accidental. Someone was feeding false information into the intelligence system. Sarah felt cold when she realized it. Someone in the tent, someone she worked with every day, was deliberately introducing errors into the intelligence flow. But why? And more importantly, which reports were false? Which information could she trust? She considered going directly to Colonel Warren or Major Hammond, but she had no proof, only suspicions and patterns that might mean nothing. And if she was wrong, if she accused someone of sabotage when it was just confusion, she would lose all credibility. She would be seen as paranoid, as unstable, as exactly what everyone had always feared about women in command positions, too emotional, too prone to seeing threats that didn't exist. So instead, she began a secret investigation. She spent hours after the other soldiers had gone to sleep, tracing every transmission, comparing field reports with official intelligence, building a map of where the false information was coming from. It took her 4 days to figure it out. Captain Wesley. It wasn't information he was falsifying directly. It was more subtle than that. He was taking accurate information and introducing small changes. A position moved slightly north instead of south. A unit strength reported as slightly higher than it actually was. Nothing so dramatic as to be obviously false, but enough to create confusion, enough to undermine confidence in the intelligence operation. Sarah's hands shook when she realized it. Captain Wesley, the man who had openly questioned whether a woman should be handling important communications, the man who had objected when she was given the British line, the man who had clearly resented her rise through the ranks. But how to prove it? How to catch him without making accusations that could be seen as personal vendetta? Sarah created a test. She prepared a piece of false intelligence, information she knew was inaccurate. She introduced it into the normal channels, along with accurate information. Then she waited to see what Wesley would do with it. If he passed the false information along unchanged, then he was a saboteur. If he corrected it, then he was just doing his job improperly. He passed the false information along. Sarah had her proof. She had the evidence she needed. She could take it to Colonel Warren. She could expose Captain Wesley. She could have him arrested for sabotage. She could destroy him. And something inside her wanted to do exactly that. She sat in the communications tent the next morning, watching Wesley work at his desk. He had no idea he was being watched. He was just going about his day, introducing his small errors into the system, confident that no one had noticed, confident that his plan was working. Derek sat down next to Sarah at her desk. "You figured it out," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him, startled. "What?" "Wesley," Derek said. "He's the one falsifying the information. You've known for a while now. You look like you haven't slept." "How did you know?" Sarah asked. "I watch people," Derek said. "I see patterns. You're watching Wesley the same way he watches the intelligence, looking for errors, looking for deception." Sarah didn't deny it. There was no point. "What are you going to do?" Derek asked. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "Yes, you do," Derek said. "You're going to have to tell someone. This is sabotage during wartime, during an active operation. People could die if false intelligence gets used in tactical decisions." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "So why aren't you telling them?" Sarah took a long time to answer. "Because if I do, I become the woman who had to ruin a man's career, not the woman who caught a saboteur, not the woman who protected the operation, just the woman who destroyed someone, and I don't know if I can survive that." "You might not have to survive it," Derek said, "but he's going to keep doing this until he's stopped, and eventually his false information is going to affect a decision that costs lives. When that happens, you'll wish you had stopped him." Derek was right, and Sarah knew it, but she was afraid, not of Wesley, not of the consequences, but of what would happen if she acted, of how she would be perceived, of whether her success would be erased by the fact that she had been the one to expose him. That afternoon, something happened that decided the matter for her. A transmission came through from a field unit. German panzer forces had been spotted moving through a particular valley. According to the accurate intelligence Sarah had received from the British, that valley should have been clear. But according to the false information that Wesley had introduced into the system, it appeared that an American artillery unit was in position in that valley. If the Americans fired on what they thought were German forces, they would actually be firing on the false intelligence Wesley had provided, which meant that German forces might be in a position the Americans didn't know about. More concerning, the false intelligence showed American units in position where American units shouldn't be. Sarah saw the discrepancy in the report. She saw what Wesley had done, and she realized that if the wrong person made a decision based on that false information, American soldiers would die. She stood up from her desk and walked directly to Colonel Warren's office. "Sir," she said, knocking on the door, "I need to speak with you about something that can't wait." Colonel Warren looked up from the reports he was reviewing. Something in Sarah's face told him this was serious. "Come in," he said. "Close the door." Sarah explained everything, the discrepancies she had noticed, the pattern she had identified, the test she had created, the way Wesley had falsified information. She showed him the evidence. She showed him the specific transmission that had come through that afternoon, the one that could have cost lives. Colonel Warren listened without interrupting. His face grew darker and more serious as Sarah spoke. When she was finished, he sat back in his chair. "This is a serious accusation," he said. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "I know it is, and I wouldn't make it unless I was absolutely certain." "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Colonel Warren asked. "Because I wanted to be absolutely certain before I made the accusation," Sarah said. "Because I knew that if I was wrong, it would destroy my credibility. It would confirm every doubt anyone had about my ability to serve in this position." Colonel Warren nodded slowly. He understood what she was saying. He understood the calculation she had made. Wait until you were absolutely certain or risk losing everything. "Get me the evidence," he said. "All of it. I want to see every discrepancy. I want to see how you identified the pattern. I want this documented completely." "I have it prepared, sir," Sarah said. She handed him the folder she had been holding. Colonel Warren opened it and began reviewing the materials. Sarah watched his expression as he read. She could see the moment he understood the scope of what Wesley had been doing. This wasn't just introducing a few errors. This was a systematic campaign to undermine the intelligence operation. This was deliberate sabotage. "I'm going to need to report this to First Army," Colonel Warren said finally. "This is beyond my authority. We're talking about potential treason during an active combat operation." "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "You'll need to be prepared to testify," Colonel Warren said. "To explain your evidence, to explain how you identified the discrepancies." "I'm prepared," Sarah said. Colonel Warren stood up. He extended his hand to Sarah and she took it. His grip was firm. "You did the right thing," he said. "I know it wasn't easy. I know you had reasons not to, but you did it anyway. That's what command looks like." Within hours, Captain Wesley was arrested. Military police escorted him out of the communications tent in front of everyone. Sarah watched from her desk as the other soldiers stared in shock. No one had seen it coming. No one had suspected. Derek appeared at her desk as soon as Wesley was gone. "That was brave," he said. "It was necessary," Sarah replied. "Those things aren't mutually exclusive," Derek said. "You could have stayed quiet, you could have let it continue. But you didn't because you knew it was wrong. That's what bravery is." But as Sarah returned to her work, she felt something other than satisfaction. She felt dread, because she knew that this wouldn't be the end of it. This would be the beginning of something else, something darker. That night, an officer she didn't recognize came to her office. His name was Major Curtis Hammond, no relation to Major Robert Hammond. He worked for the Military Intelligence Division. He had questions. "We've been reviewing Captain Wesley's service record," Major Curtis Hammond said. "And we've been reviewing yours. Interesting story. Woman moves up through the ranks faster than almost anyone we've seen. Then she identifies a saboteur. Creates enough doubt about the integrity of our intelligence that people are going to question whether any of the information she's processed has been compromised." Sarah felt her stomach turn. She saw where this was going. "I processed that information correctly," she said carefully. "Did you?" Major Curtis Hammond asked. "Or did you process it the way you wanted it to be processed? Did you allow your ambition to affect your judgment? Did you introduce errors yourself and then blame Wesley for them?" "That's not what happened," Sarah said. "That's what I'm suggesting could be perceived as happening," Major Curtis Hammond said. He leaned back in his chair. "You see, we have a situation here. We have a woman who climbed ranks faster than anyone expected. We have her accusing a man of sabotage. We have that man now in custody based entirely on her evidence. And now we have to figure out whether the accuser is trustworthy or whether she's just someone who wanted to eliminate a rival." "There is no rivalry," Sarah said. "Wesley was falsifying information that was going to get people killed." "That's your story," Major Curtis Hammond said. "But there's another story that's equally plausible, that you wanted the glory for catching a saboteur, that you created evidence, that you're ambitious and willing to destroy someone else to get ahead." Sarah felt something break inside her. She had known it would come to this. She had feared this. This was the other side of being seen. This was the cost of stepping out of the shadows. "I want a lawyer," she said quietly. "You're not under arrest," Major Curtis Hammond said. "Not yet. Right now, we're just having a conversation. I'm just wondering out loud about how we're going to explain all of this to First Army. How we're going to convince them that your intelligence is reliable when there's a question about your judgment. A question about whether you have a bias against male officers. A question about whether you have what it takes to be in a position of authority." He stood up and walked toward the door. "You did a good thing by reporting Wesley," he said. "Assuming he actually did what you say he did. But you also opened a door, Captain. You let people start asking questions, and now those questions might be harder to answer than you thought." He left her alone in the office. Sarah sat in the darkness of the small room, and she felt more alone than she had ever felt. She had done the right thing. She knew she had done the right thing, but doing the right thing wasn't always enough. Sometimes it came at a price that was higher than she could have imagined. Derek found her 2 hours later, still sitting in the dark. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let me get you something to eat." "I don't want to eat," Sarah said. "I know," Derek replied. "But you're going to anyway because you have to stay strong because this isn't over." "It's over," Sarah said. "I'm finished. I gave them the ammunition they needed to destroy me." "No," Derek said. "You did the hard thing. You told the truth. Now you have to live with the consequences of that truth. That's the next part of the story." Sarah looked at her friend. She could see the worry in his eyes. She could see that he cared. She could see that he believed in her. "What if I can't?" she asked. "You can," Derek said. "Because you already have. You've already survived the worst part. Now you just have to prove you were right." And she would have to do it while carrying the weight of every doubt, every suspicion, every question about whether her judgment was sound. She would have to do it under the scrutiny of men who had a vested interest in proving that a woman wasn't capable of command. The Ruhr pocket was still closing. The war was still being won. But Sarah's personal war was just beginning. The hearing took place in a conference room at First Army Headquarters, 5 miles from Fort Sheridan. Sarah sat at a table across from 3 officers she had never met before. They represented military intelligence, command authority, and legal affairs. Somewhere in the room, there was a recording device taking down every word for the official record. Major Curtis Hammond sat across from her, presenting the accusation. The accusation, formally, was not against Sarah. It was about the reliability of all intelligence processed through her coordination center. It was about whether errors had been introduced intentionally. It was about whether the operation could trust the information that Sarah had been providing. But everyone in the room knew the real accusation. It was that Sarah had manipulated Wesley, that she had set him up, that she had destroyed him to advance her own career. "Captain Mitchell has shown unusual ambition," Major Curtis Hammond told the panel. "She moved through the ranks faster than anyone on record. She was assigned to a position normally reserved for much more senior officers. She was elevated to captain based on a single tactical recommendation. In my estimation, this pattern suggests someone who might be willing to bend the rules, to manipulate circumstances, to accomplish her goals at the expense of others. Sarah sat in silence, her hands folded on the table in front of her. She had been instructed by a military lawyer assigned to her case to say nothing unless directly asked a question. Respond with yes or no answers whenever possible. Don't provide explanation unless pressed for it. "We are concerned," one of the panel members, a colonel named Reynolds, said, "that Captain Mitchell may have had access to the intelligence system in ways that would have allowed her to introduce false information herself, that she may have done so in order to frame Captain Wesley, that she may be using her position to eliminate rivals." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah's lawyer, Captain Robert Stern, stood up. He was 60 years old, had been a lawyer in civilian life for 30 years, and had the bearing of someone who had seen every kind of injustice that institutions could create. "With respect, sir," he said, "this theory is based entirely on speculation. You have evidence. You have Captain Mitchell's testimony regarding the false information. You have the discrepancies she identified. You have the proof that Captain Wesley introduced errors into the system. What you don't have is any evidence that Captain Mitchell did any of those things herself." "We have the evidence that she had the access," another panel member said, a major named Foster. "Having access is not the same as having used that access," Stern replied. "Many people had access to that system. By that logic, any of them could be suspected." "But how many of them reported the sabotage?" Major Curtis Hammond asked. "How many of them benefited from the exposure of the saboteur? Captain Mitchell is the only one who benefits from this situation. She becomes a hero. She becomes the one who caught the saboteur. She becomes the woman who stood up and did the right thing. The optics are perfect for her advancement." Sarah felt her face flush. She wanted to stand up, wanted to defend herself, wanted to scream that she wasn't doing this for advancement, that she had reported it because it was the right thing to do, that the cost of reporting it had been far greater than the benefit. But she said nothing, because Captain Stern had instructed her not to, because anything she said could be twisted against her. "Captain Mitchell," Colonel Reynolds said, "I'm going to ask you directly. Did you introduce false information into the intelligence system in order to frame Captain Wesley?" "No, sir," Sarah said. "Did you manipulate Captain Wesley in any way in order to create the appearance of sabotage?" "No, sir," Sarah said. "Did you have any personal conflict with Captain Wesley prior to this incident?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment too long. Colonel Reynolds leaned forward. "Captain Mitchell," he prompted. "Captain Wesley objected to my assignment to the British communications line," Sarah said carefully. "He questioned whether a woman should be handling that responsibility. He made other comments suggesting he didn't think I was qualified. But I reported no personal conflict because I didn't consider those comments relevant to my work performance." "But now you see how those comments might have given you motivation," Major Curtis Hammond said. "He challenged your authority, he questioned your competence, and then you had an opportunity to destroy him." "I didn't want to destroy him," Sarah said, still speaking quietly. "I wanted to stop the sabotage. The destruction of his career was a consequence of his own actions." "Was it?" Major Curtis Hammond leaned back in his chair. "Or was it a convenient consequence that you actually engineered?" Captain Stern stood up. "Sir, I object to the line of questioning. Major Hammond is asking Captain Mitchell to speculate on her own motivations based on a theory he has constructed with no evidence." "Overruled," Colonel Reynolds said. "Captain Mitchell will answer." Sarah looked at the three panel members. She understood now what was happening. This wasn't a hearing about whether Wesley had sabotaged the intelligence. This was a hearing about whether a woman was capable of holding command authority. This was an attempt to prove that she was too ambitious, too willing to manipulate, too dangerous to trust. "I engineered nothing," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "I followed the protocol for identifying discrepancies in intelligence reports. I documented those discrepancies. When I had enough evidence to suspect sabotage, I reported it to my commanding officer. I did exactly what any officer would have done. The only difference is that I'm a woman, and so you're asking me to defend myself as if I must have done something wrong. As if my success must be based on deception rather than competence." The room went very quiet. "Strong words," Colonel Reynolds said finally. "True words, sir," Sarah replied. "Let's talk about your evidence," the third panel member, Major Richard Price, said. He had been quiet until now. "Walk us through how you identified the discrepancies." Sarah did. She explained every step. She explained how she had noticed patterns, how she had compared information across multiple sources, how she had created a test to verify her suspicions. She explained the science of it, the methodology, the careful documentation. As she spoke, she watched the faces of the panel members. She could see Price beginning to understand, could see him taking notes, could see him recognizing the work of someone who knew what she was doing. When she was finished, Price sat back. "That's good work," he said. "That's careful intelligence analysis. That's exactly the kind of systematic approach we need in this field." "It's also the work of someone who was already planning to set up Wesley," Major Curtis Hammond said. "Creating a test that would trap him, documenting it so carefully that even we couldn't argue with it." "Or," Price said, "it's the work of someone who wanted to be absolutely certain before making a serious accusation. Someone who understood the stakes, someone who was being careful." Captain Stern approached the panel with a file. "I'd like to submit for the record the full documentation of Captain Mitchell's intelligence work over the past month. I'd like you to review not just the discrepancies she identified, but all the other intelligence she processed. I'd like you to see if there are any errors in the intelligence she personally handled that aren't attributable to Captain Wesley." Colonel Reynolds took the file. He began reviewing it. Sarah watched as his expression changed. She could see him flipping through page after page of analysis. Perfect information, careful documentation. Work that showed someone who had been doing their job with precision and integrity. "Captain Mitchell," Reynolds said finally, "I'm going to ask you about your career. You've advanced very quickly. Have you experienced difficulties because of your gender?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "Can you describe those difficulties?" Sarah hesitated. This was tricky ground. She didn't want to sound bitter, didn't want to sound like she was complaining, but she also needed to be honest. "I have been questioned about decisions that I made," she said. "Not because there was evidence that my decisions were wrong, but because I'm a woman. I have been bypassed for assignments that my qualifications suited me for. I have been given less credit for my work than male officers would receive. When I achieved promotion, I heard comments suggesting that it was based on factors other than merit. Those are the difficulties, sir, not hostility, not open discrimination, but a constant assumption that I need to prove more than male officers do." "And yet you did prove yourself," Colonel Reynolds said. "You did excellent work." "I had to, sir," Sarah said. "The cost of failure was higher for me than it would have been for someone else." Reynolds set down the file. He looked at his fellow panel members. Something passed between them, some kind of understanding. "We're going to take a recess," he said. "Be back in 1 hour." Sarah and Captain Stern left the hearing room. Outside in the hallway, Stern put his hand on her shoulder. "That was good," he said quietly. "You answered their questions directly. You didn't get defensive. You didn't cry. You didn't lose your temper." "I wanted to," Sarah admitted. "I know," Stern said, "but you didn't. That matters." When the hearing reconvened, Colonel Reynolds had a statement to make. After reviewing the evidence presented, he said, "This panel finds that Captain Sarah Mitchell conducted a thorough and professional investigation into discrepancies in the intelligence system. We find no evidence that Captain Mitchell introduced false information or manipulated the evidence against Captain Wesley. We find that her methodology was sound and her documentation was careful. However, we are concerned about the possibility of bias in her investigation. We are recommending that a full independent review be conducted of all intelligence processed through her office." Sarah's heart sank. An independent review meant months of scrutiny, meant her work being questioned by people who might be predisposed to find errors, meant potential reassignment if any questions about her judgment emerged. But then Major Price spoke. "I would like to add to that statement," he said. "In my view, the methodology employed by Captain Mitchell sets a standard that we should expect from all of our intelligence personnel. I recommend that she be retained in her position and that her work be used as a model for future intelligence operations. I further recommend that the independent review focus on verifying the accuracy of her intelligence analysis, not on questioning her integrity." Colonel Reynolds nodded. "We agree. The review will proceed with that understanding." When Sarah and Stern walked out of the hearing, she felt like she was walking through a dream. She had survived it. She had been vindicated. But the price tag was still there. She would be under scrutiny for months. People would be looking for evidence against her. People would be trying to find reasons to prove that she had done something wrong. Derek was waiting for her outside the building. "Well," he asked. "I'm still a captain," Sarah said. "I'm still in my position, but I'm also still under investigation." "That's a win," Derek said. "Is it?" Sarah asked. "I'm more visible than ever, I'm more exposed than ever, more vulnerable than ever." "Yes," Derek said, "but you're also proven, you're also vindicated, and now people know that you can stand up to pressure. That matters." Back at Fort Sheridan, Sarah returned to her office. She found a note on her desk from Colonel Warren. It read, "You did well, get some rest, we have a war to win. Warren." Over the next 3 weeks, the independent review proceeded. Trained auditors went through every piece of intelligence Sarah had processed since arriving at Fort Sheridan. Every calculation, every correlation, every analysis. When they were finished, their report concluded that her intelligence was 97% accurate, that the 3% error rate was entirely attributable to errors in the source material, information that had come from the field already corrupted or confused, that her methodology for identifying and eliminating those errors was superior to standard practices. The report recommended that her methods be adopted across all intelligence operations. The review that was supposed to destroy Sarah had instead made her more secure, more valuable, more essential. Major Curtis Hammond was quietly reassigned to another theater of operations. No explanation was given. No statement was made. He simply disappeared from Fort Sheridan. The message was clear. He had overreached. He had tried to destroy Sarah and he had failed. And now he was being removed because he represented a liability, someone who would question the integrity of their intelligence operations. But Sarah didn't feel victorious. She felt tired. She felt haunted by what had almost happened, by how close she had come to being destroyed by someone who had more power and authority than she did, by how fragile her position still was, despite everything she had accomplished. Derek found her in her office late one evening, reviewing maps of the Ruhr Valley. "It's over," he said. "It's not over," Sarah replied. "It's just paused. It will happen again, maybe not with Wesley, maybe not with Hammond, but it will happen again because I'm a woman in a position of authority. That's never going to stop being a problem." "You're right," Derek said. "It probably will happen again, but you know something now that you didn't know before. You know you can survive it. You know you can stand up to it. You know you can prove yourself even when people are trying to destroy you." Sarah set down the maps. She looked at her young friend. She realized that he had been the only consistent thing in her life for weeks, the only person who had believed in her without question, the only person who had pushed her forward when she wanted to collapse backward. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me," Derek said. "Just finish the job, just close the Ruhr pocket, just win the war, that's all I need." Sarah nodded, and despite her exhaustion, despite her uncertainty, she felt something like hope. Because the Ruhr pocket was still closing, the war was still being won, and she was going to be part of it, not invisible, not in the shadows, but right there in the center of things where history was being made. The final phase of the operation was Ob.